Alison Weir, we just heard Eugene Byrd there. Tell us the influence that Israelis, if you can elaborate more on that, Israelis have in terms of their control in U.S. policy in Congress and the Senate. And of course, some go as far as saying Hollywood, which we're going to get into a little later.
Israel has massive influence in both the U.S. media and in Hollywood. Anybody who researches this finds that fact. There's so much evidence for it. Helen Thomas did not say that they were the only ones that had any influence or any role in it. But what she did say was quite accurate, that they dominate the media, that very often they're significant in media coverage. We've done a number of studies about how the U.S. media, mainstream media, the mainstream network news, for example, covers Israel-Palestine, how it covers the deaths. And we found in every case that Israeli deaths are covered in far greater ratios and proportions than Palestinian deaths, up to, for the network news program, sometimes they're covering Israeli children's deaths up to 14 times greater than they are reporting on Palestinian children's deaths, even though the Palestinian deaths came first in every case. In our analyses of the media, we consistently find that the Israel slant is what's reported in U.S. media, that, for example, when they talk about who has broken a ceasefire, a study has shown that in 96% of the cases at least, if the ceasefire was a little bit longer, it's in 100% of the cases, Israel was the party that broke the ceasefire, and yet the U.S. media almost always report it as the Palestinian factions breaking the ceasefires.
Okay.
So the fact is that there's major influence in the U.S. media by Zionists. That's the reality.
Let me get a reaction from Carol Gould in terms of what former U.S. Secretary of State James Baker has titled the U.S. Congress the Little Knesset.
Well, I must live in a parallel universe because I watch American television all the time. Every night I watch Brian Williams, Katie Couric, Diane Sawyer. I watch Charlie Rose, Anderson Cooper. I don't see anything there, anything whatsoever, praising Israel, looking at how wonderful Israel. If anything, if I want to know what's going on in Israel, like this past week, the terrible fire in the Carmel, I had to go to my computer because there was zero coverage, zero, none whatsoever. And this point the young lady just made who spoke, I'm afraid I don't have a monitor, so I don't know her name, forgive me.
Alison Weir.
But she mentioned about, yes, Alison Weir. The Israeli children covered first there, that the Palestinians are killed first. Excuse me, rockets have been coming into southern Israel from Gaza since Israel left Gaza. And the reason why Israel finally had to go in was to stop the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rockets coming into southern Israel. Children in Israel having to live in bomb shelters, not being able to go to school. So
okay.
This business about...
You didn't give a reaction to what I mentioned, so let me... You didn't give a reaction to what James Baker, the former U.S.
Jews. They're not run by Zionists.
Carol Gould, you didn't give a reaction to my question to you, so let me go to another quote. This is Israel's former Sephardic chief rabbi, Mordechai Elihu, advocated carpet bombing of Gaza. He said, quote, "There's absolutely no moral prohibition against the indiscriminate killing of civilians during massive military offensive in Gaza." Quoted on the Jerusalem Post, May 30, 2007. Why don't we hear that in U.S. media?
I'm sure that you do. I mean, it's on CNN's website. All of these discussions about the Shas rabbi saying that the Palestinians should be driven into the sea was reported. These rabbis do not represent the majority of Israel. Most Israelis are secular. 85% don't even go into a synagogue, so they are not represented by the religious right. I'll go back to James Baker's comment about the little Knesset. That's just a very nasty comment because there are hardly any Jews in the Senate and Congress. It is mostly Christians, almost overwhelmingly. If the Zionists and the Jews ran America, wouldn't we have had a Jewish president or vice president by now? I ask your guests. If they're so powerful, why haven't we just had a string of
Eugene
Jewish
Byrd, you could come in now and react to Carol Gould's question.
Well, let me tell you, when I was last in Jerusalem, 2 years ago. I was there last May also, but 2 years ago I took a bunch of Obama stickers and I found a Jewish Orthodox, not a Hasidic, but an Orthodox standing outside of Damascus Gate, and we had a camera, and I put an Obama sticker on his coat and said, "What do you think of Obama?" And he looked down at the sticker for a moment and then smiled and said, "Oh, I love Obama. Now we can have a Jewish president." I thought it was a great moment, and of course I have no objection to a Jewish president. I think we will have one maybe before we have a woman president. Then we asked him, what about the Palestinians on the West Bank and in here in Jerusalem, in the Old City? And he looked down at the ground and shook his head and said, "I don't know why these people want this land." Now, for a Zionist to say that, it shows a disconnect with reality, shall we say. And, you know, the original inhabitants for the last 2,000 years have been Palestinians and Greek Orthodox, and there have always been a small group of Israelis. Now we have 50% of the people west of the Jordan River are Jewish and 50% are Palestinian.
Okay.
It's time to make peace.
That is. And when you mentioned the word disconnect, Alison Weir, why is there a disconnect? I mean, is the media to blame?
I think the media is to blame. I think that if Americans got the full facts on this issue, our U.S. policies would be considerably different. But consistently, we don't get the overall facts. We get Israeli-centric reporting. I'd like to address, for example, Carol Gould talking about the rockets from Gaza, which do exist. There have been not just hundreds, there have been thousands of them. And the U.S. media report that all the time, as they should. What they oddly never report is how many deaths those thousands of rockets have caused in the approximately 8 or 9 years that they have been fired. The number is, and I wonder if Mrs. Gould knows this number, the number is under 20. Last I looked, it was 18 people who had been killed by rockets. As you'll recall, more people were killed by Israeli forces in a few minutes during the invasion of Gaza than all of the people that were killed by rockets fired from Gaza. And yet we're never told those very obtainable statistics. Why not? It's very easy to learn those numbers. They're important for American viewers to know, and yet we're never given those. We're also not told that, for example, what I saw when I visited Gaza myself in early 2001 was that Gaza had already been invaded numerous times by Israeli forces, shelled, entire neighborhoods were bullet-riddled and in ruins. The Tufa area of Khan Yunis, for example, is a neighborhood that I walked through personally that was in ruins from Israeli shelling. This was before there had been a single rocket fired from Gaza. And yet, American media coverage consistently makes it appear that Israeli actions are retaliations, when the reality is that over 90 Palestinian children were killed before an Israeli child was killed in the current round of violence that began in fall of 2000.
Okay.
So